Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of today's lecture series on erotic art. And in this section of this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the male body in particular. So right at the outset, I just want to take a moment to look at some cases in which the imagery of the male phallus and male genitalia in particular is not necessarily interpreted as a directly overtly sexual image. So in one case, we have the Herms, these Greek statue types with the column body, a phallus, and then a portrait head of some type on top that were used as boundary markers and considered as sacred objects. So we have the phallus as a sacred symbol. And then in Roman period, we have this tintinnabulum here, this little bell, little wind chime object that again has a person fighting with their own phallus that has turned into an animal, the head of an animal. So again, an image that is sort of comical, is definitely sexual, but isn't directly about intercourse, right? So like the idea that eroticism always has to do with intercourse, or that every image of sexuality is or every image of genitalia is in some way erotic. Those two things do not necessarily equate. So when we're looking at men and starting to look from the early period where we first start seeing monumental sculptures of the male body, early on, we see this growing emphasis on musculature and appreciation for the male form, particularly the male form of someone like an athlete. Now, significantly in Greek culture, we see nudity adopted as the major costume of the gods from an early period. So here we have the pedamental sculpture from the west facade of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, so one of the most prominent temples in mainland Greece. And here we have the god Apollo. Zeus is on the opposite eastern facade of this temple. So here we have the god Apollo making a blessing gesture. He is nude. There is sort of an emphasis on the lithe musculature of his body. He is strong, but not hypermusculatured, because he is not that kind of god. He's the god of music, the god of poetry, the god of the sun. But still, we see him adopt the guise of heroic nudity here. And the artist is using that as a way of representing his godhood. So we see that also adapted later on in Greek face paintings, where we have here, for example, Zeus is clothed, the god Zeus, he's bearded, he's got a spear, but he's pursuing this nude youth, Ganymede, which according to mythological tradition was a lover, taken up into Mount Olympus to the realm of the gods by Zeus in order to serve as his cupbearer, this youth, Ganymede here, who's kind of holding a rooster and playing with a stick and a hoop. So we see nudity also in this mythological realm, showing heroes, and it gets adapted as a sort of artistic idiom for the importance of virility as part of the culture. We also see a lot of sort of homoerotic imagery from this period of the Greek classical world and the archaic world. And so here we have this kylix that we have seen before with mature males signified by their beards bringing gifts to their younger lovers. So we have the pederastic tradition of the symposium, where you have a mentoring and sexual relationship with a younger male as a more mature male. And this is considered part of the sort of societal education, particularly of the elites in society. So your male lover was equally important, but very different and completely separate than, for example, your wife. These are totally separate relationships. Both are societally acceptable at this time. And this kind of relationship merits frequent depiction. Here we see another example of a mature bearded man offering gifts to a younger male lover. And the popularity of this imagery, of course, may signify some sort of societal, widespread cultural activity going on here. So another realm in which we see nudity sort of adopted as the proper costume for a male is in the realm of athletics. So here we have an image from another red figure crater. this one from about 510 BC, and here we see young men engaged in grooming activities over here. They are wearing wreaths on their heads, so they sort of have the iconography of victorious athletes. Here's one pouring oil into his hand, ready to oil up his body. This one, as you can see, has tied his genitals up, which was something that some of the Greeks did to keep them safe while doing public nude exercise. So this was another arena in addition to the symposium in which men formed social bonds and social relationships with one another while exercising nude. And here we can see at least one of these little written inscriptions here is able to be made out. It says Leandros Kalos, so Leandros is handsome. So even in this sort of athletic realm that is social, we have this appreciation for the male body, for the beauty of the male body. Leandros is super handsome. I appreciate it. He's a great athlete. Hopefully I am as well. So we have this sort of competition, this aesthetic competition playing out through the form of the human body among men. So again, athletes and heroic nudity, this is a common thing that we see. So these are here's our Riace soldier. We have an apoxiomenos here, so someone who's scraping the oil off of themselves after exercise, and then our Discobolus again. So this appreciation for showing the musculature of the body, an emphasis on the strength of the male, using beardedness to signify age, and minimizing the sort of prominence of genitalia in these images, and rather focusing on the sort of other expressions of the masculine body, such as musculature. So as we've seen so many times in the Hellenistic period, there's often a sort of response to the classical mode. And one way in which we see the masculine form change, especially in its more erotic connotations, is that in this period, there are more frequent depictions of sort of men at rest, the very highly muscled man who is actually worn out by physical activity. So showing the results of athletic competition, such as the boxer image that we looked at in a previous lecture, and also in the case of this weary Hercules figure. So this shows the hero Hercules, he's recognizable by his lion skin and club that he's leaning on here. And he's actually at the end of his 12 labors in this image, holding behind his back the apples of the Hesperides, the fruits of the literal fruits of the final labor that he performs before being released from the necessity of performing these superhuman tasks over and over again. So here we see Hercules in his mortal pre-god form, and he is both the strongest, most heavily muscle-bound man that you could ever imagine, with this luscious beard signifying his intense virility, but at the same time he's exhausted and can barely hold his own weight up anymore. Now here at the end of my section on the male body, I want to briefly visit and take you on a detour to a much later story, which is the beautiful love story between Emperor Hadrian and the youth Antinous, who came from an area called Bithynia in the east. And Hadrian, who was the emperor from about 117 to 138 CE, he was known as a great Philhellene, so a great admirer of Greek culture, who enjoyed emulating aspects of Greek culture, including those that were not necessarily in line with later Roman beliefs. So he sort of continued on this tradition of the pederastic youth, mature male relationship very prominently in his lifetime with this youth Antinous that he met on one of his journeys abroad. The story of Hadrian and Antinous is a wonderful tragedy. I encourage you to look into it more closely. And they had this great romantic relationship, but as Antinous started to sort of age out of the appropriate age for a male to be in a relationship with an older male, and became sort of mature in his own right, the relationship became complicated and more difficult for the public to kind of conceive of and stomach as a proper piece of behavior for their emperor. And at this point, around that time, Hadrian and Antinous were on a tour of Egypt. And Antinous, at some point on this tour, drowned tragically in the Nile. And there were all sorts of rumors at the time about the fact that maybe Hadrian had actually just engaged in witchcraft and had Antinous sacrificed for him. He had pushed Antinous into the water because he was going to be unable to further pursue their relationship, that Antinous had felt like he was growing too old and had tragically sacrificed himself to protect the public image of the emperor that he loved. So there's all sorts of sort of salacious rumors floating around at the time period about what happened between these two. But the really interesting piece to me is what happens afterwards, which is that Emperor Hadrian goes absolutely wild to make sure that Antinous is remembered. And he does this by declaring Antinous a god, first in the area of Egypt where he drowned, and then throughout the entire Roman Empire. And so Antinous becomes one of the most frequently represented figures in antique art. We have hundreds of statue depictions of him, for example, and he becomes syncretized, combined with all sorts of different Roman gods from across the different provinces of the empire. So here we have him in a guise like Bacchus, wearing an animal skin, holding a cantharos, a wine cup, and dressed with grapes and ivy leaves on his head. Here we have him taking on the form of the athlete, the Doryphorus statue type. Here we have him in the guise of Silvus, a similar god to Bacchus, a god of sort of the natural world and the grape harvest, accompanied by a little dog here. And then we have him in the guise of a sort of an Egyptian pharaoh here, wearing the loincloth of Egypt and a headdress as well. So after Antinous is declared a god, he becomes very genuinely sort of adopted by people in these areas and popularized as a deity, as a protective deity in particular. So it's a very successful effort on behalf of Hadrian, on the part of Hadrian, to maintain the memory of his young lover. And he does this not through the production of any sort of overtly erotic imagery, but rather through the production just of many, many, many images as an act of love in and of itself. So while, the story of Hadrian and Antinous, and here's just two more images here, more examples of these statue types, is not one of erotic images per se, but it is of the way that images can kind of bring to life some of the erotic relationships between people and be used as a vehicle for expressing love in addition to displaying acts of erotic intent. So with that, what I want you to do is just to go to the Canvas Weekly Assignments folder. You will find there a document which is called Ancient Lovers, Some Online Resources. And in that document is a list of all of the images by number that you can find in the PowerPoint. And I want you to just spend a little bit of time looking through the documents that are related to the image you chose previously. You can also search around on the internet some more for things related to your topic. Don't spend more than 20 minutes working through this at this point. You're going to be coming back to this again, so don't worry about it. Don't spend too much time. I hope you are enjoying this time, and I will see you in the next lecture.